Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. I was standing by the stove, stirring a thick tomato sauce, when muffled voices from Michael's office reached my ears. Normally, I don't listen in on his calls. Work is work, and I've always respected his boundaries. But this time, something caught my attention. Maybe it was his tone. He sounded animated, even warm. It was so unlike his usual curt, dry business remarks. Quietly, I placed the spoon on the edge of the pot and stepped closer to the door. The words became clearer. "You looked stunning today," he said, his voice carrying a soft smile. "See you soon. Love you." I froze. The words echoed in my chest like a blow. The kitchen suddenly felt stifling. I knew it could mean nothing, but my heart clenched as if someone had tied it into a tight knot. I returned to the stove, but the sauce no longer mattered. My hands were trembling, and the spoon slipped, leaving a vivid red stain on the light countertop. Later that evening, over dinner, I tried to strike up a conversation. "How's work?" I asked, trying to sound natural. He barely glanced at me, placing his phone face down on the edge of the table. "Fine. Lots of calls, projects in full swing." I waited for more, but he picked up his phone again, as if he'd forgotten I was there. I watched him, anger slowly replacing the initial shock. Was this how we were meant to live? Two shadows at the same table? But I said nothing. I couldn't even ask. Who were you talking to like that? It seemed pointless. Maybe I'd misheard. Maybe it was a colleague or a client. But my thoughts whispered otherwise. If he can hide something from me so easily, why should I try to be the perfect wife? After dinner, I glanced out the window, hoping to distract myself, and I saw him. A tall man was unloading boxes from a van in the driveway of the house next door. His movements were confident, and the slight smile on his face seemed to say, "I know someone is watching." And he noticed me. His eyes met mine, and I instinctively stepped back, feeling a slight flush creep up my cheeks. But he didn't look away. Instead, he waved, a friendly, casual gesture. That brief moment caught me off guard. I realized I hadn't felt noticed in a long time. Not as a homemaker, not as a wife, as a woman. Later, while walking near the house, I saw him again. He stood by his garage, arms crossed. His clothes were simple, but fit him perfectly. Sweatpants and a dark t-shirt that hinted at a well-built figure. I couldn't help but pause as he approached me. "Good evening, neighbor," he said with a friendly smile. "Good evening," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm Oliver. Just moved in. Nice to meet you." His gaze was direct but not imposing. He looked at me as though he saw something beyond a woman walking her dog or taking out the trash. "Alice, welcome to the neighborhood." "Thank you," he said, then added, gesturing to my scarf, "That color looks great on you." I couldn't help but smile. The compliment was simple but sincere. "Thank you," I said, glancing away slightly. The conversation was brief, but it left me feeling as though hours had passed under his gaze. That feeling lingered for the rest of the evening. Later, sitting in the bedroom, I stared at my phone, where a message from Michael read, "Working late. Don't wait up." I hadn't been waiting for a long time, and as the light in the house across the street remained on, I wondered, why could this stranger make me feel alive in just 5 minutes, while my own husband had lost that ability long ago? I ran out of the house, hoping to beat the rain, but the first drops were already brushing against my skin. Thick gray clouds blanketed the sky, and the air was rich with the scent of damp earth. I quickened my pace, aiming for the cafe on the corner, where I often bought my morning coffee. By the time I opened the door, the gentle drizzle had turned into a full-blown downpour. Under the awning by the entrance stood Oliver. He turned at the sound of the door, a smile spreading across his face. "Alice, it seems the weather has a sense of humor today," he said, shaking rainwater from his hair. I smiled back, despite the embarrassment bubbling inside. Yes, it seems my umbrella betrayed me today. I stopped near him, feeling the raindrops slide down my hair. Oliver handed me a napkin. You look like you just stepped out of a romantic scene in the rain, he joked. I laughed, though I noticed his gaze lingered on me a moment longer than expected. There was something between us, an unspoken ease that made it easy to forget he was practically a stranger. Do you come here often? He asked, filling the pause. Sometimes. The coffee's pretty good, I replied, still hesitant to meet his eyes. The conversation meandered from the weather to the neighbors to his work, but the longer we talked, the more I felt drawn into his presence. It was as if the rain muted the world around us, leaving only this moment. Oliver leaned in slightly, his voice softening. You know, ever since I moved here, I've started noticing things I hadn't before, like how someone can look utterly captivating, even in this kind of weather. I looked up, warmth rushing to my cheeks. His gaze was so steady and deep that it made it hard to breathe. You're too kind, I murmured. He said nothing, just kept looking at me. Then, so quickly I barely registered it, he leaned in and our lips met. It was unexpected, brief, but it was so charged with emotion that the world seemed to stand still. I pulled away sharply, my heart pounding in my chest. I have to go, I whispered, avoiding his eyes. I turned and walked away, forcing myself not to run, though the rain had soaked me through. Every step home felt like an eternity. When I entered the house, Michael was, as usual, busy in his office. His voice filtered through the closed door as he spoke with colleagues. I sat on the living room couch, clutching my wet bag, and felt a wave of panic swell inside me. What was that? I asked myself. I tried to think logically. It was just a moment. It doesn't mean anything. Just an impulse. We're both adults, and these things happen. But even my inner reasoning sounded hollow. My lips still tingled from that brief yet intense encounter. I went to the bedroom to change, carefully avoiding the door to Michael's office. He didn't even notice I'd come home. Everything was as it always was. Quiet, measured, proper. Standing in front of the mirror, changing into dry clothes, I caught my reflection. My cheeks were flushed, and my eyes sparkled with a brightness I hadn't seen in years. It scared me. This changes nothing, I told myself firmly. It was a mistake. We'll both pretend it never happened. Everything will stay the same. But deep down, I knew I couldn't forget that moment. When Michael finally emerged from his office to ask if I'd eaten yet, I responded in my usual tone. I smiled, made tea, and asked about his calls. But inside, I was far away. When I opened the door for Oliver, his smile was so natural that it made breathing easier. Hi, Alice. Are you busy? He asked, leaning against the doorframe. I need help with a few things in the house. I'm not good at this sort of thing, but it seems like you're just the person who knows how it all should look. His words sounded simple, but his gaze was a touch more insistent than what was typical for a casual request. Well, I'm not a professional, I began, slightly flustered. But why not? He nodded, and we headed to his house together. Inside, everything was surprisingly minimalist. Boxes sat unpacked in the corner, and the living room felt cool and empty. As you can see, this place could use a bit of warmth, Oliver said, gesturing toward the bare walls. I think you might have some ideas about how to fix that. Well, I drew out the word, scanning the room. Maybe add more textiles? Rugs, pillows, curtains. They always create a cozy atmosphere. Yeah, that sounds good, he said, watching me closely as I moved through the room, pointing out where furniture could go or where artwork might be hung. Are you sure you're not a designer? I laughed, shaking my head. It's just a couple of suggestions. But with every step and every glance, I felt something growing between us, intangible, yet palpable. With him, I could be myself. Not a wife, not the lady of the house, but simply Alice, a person who was seen and heard. We spent more than an hour discussing the little details. I started noticing how he caught my eyes, as if waiting for something more than a conversation about upholstery colors. I can suggest a few stores where you'll find everything you need, I added, trying to lighten the atmosphere. You really think of everything, he said with a faint smile. Later, as I was about to leave, Oliver walked me to the door. We stopped, and he said, Alice, you know, you deserve to be appreciated. His voice was soft, but there was a confidence in his words. For a moment, my heart stood still. I looked up at him and noticed something new in his eyes. It wasn't just curiosity or playfulness. It was real. Thank you, I murmured, quickly averting my gaze as warmth spread through my body. I took a step back, as if retreating to reality. Alice, he called softly, but I couldn't stay any longer. I have to go, I said and stepped out, feeling his gaze following me all the way to the door. When I got home, Michael was still buried in his work at the computer. I heard his voice from the study, but he didn't bother to come out and greet me. I took off my coat, set my bag on the couch, and looked out the window. The light in Oliver's house was still on, glowing like a beacon. I stood before the mirror, staring at my reflection. What am I doing? I asked myself, but there was no answer. I stood in front of the wardrobe, sifting through hangers of dresses, feeling a twinge of panic. Most of them looked too casual. Finally, I found the one, a light dark blue satin dress that Michael had always loved. It had been tucked away for years behind more practical clothes. I thought maybe it would remind him of who I was when we first got married and how he used to love me. Dinner was already waiting in the kitchen. I had spent hours preparing it. Baked salmon, arugula salad with lemon dressing, and a strawberry and chocolate dessert. Everything looked perfect. I lit candles, turned on some soft music, and sat down to wait. The clock ticked. 30 minutes. An hour. He still wasn't home. I checked my phone. No messages, no calls. Maybe he's held up at work, I thought, though the idea did little to comfort me. The warm food grew cold, the candles burned down, and a wave of irritation began to rise inside me. When Michael finally came home, his face looked tired, his tie loosened. He barely noticed my efforts. Oh, you were waiting? He said, tossing his coat over the back of a chair. Sorry, there was a meeting. I stood by the table, trying to appear calm despite the frustration bubbling inside me. I made dinner, I said, gesturing to the plates. He glanced at the food and muttered, It looks amazing, Alice, but I ate so much at the meeting. I think I'll just take a shower. He disappeared into the bathroom, leaving me in a silence that buzzed with the sting of rejection. Slowly, I cleared the table, trying to ignore the lump forming in my throat. The dress I'd pinned so much hope on now felt ridiculous. By the time Michael returned, I was already lying in bed, pretending to be asleep. There wasn't even a hint of regret in his voice. The next day, I went for a walk to clear my head. I needed somewhere to channel my anger and confusion. My feet instinctively carried me to the small park around the corner, a place I loved. I stopped by the pond, staring at the water, when I heard a familiar voice. Alice? I turned around. It was Oliver. He looked at ease, jeans, a light jacket, a thermos of coffee in hand. Out here alone again? He asked with a faint smile. It seems to be my hobby these days, I replied, trying to keep my voice even. We walked to a bench under an old oak tree, and I felt the words spilling out of me. I've tried, I really have. But it feels like the more I try, the less he notices me. It's like I've become part of the furniture to him. Oliver listened intently, not interrupting. His presence was light, unobtrusive, but it only made me want to keep talking. I don't want to complain, I continued. It's just, sometimes it feels like I'm shouting into a void, but no one hears me. Alice, he finally said, you need to stop blaming yourself for being human. What do you mean? I asked, turning to him. You deserve to be appreciated, truly appreciated. To have someone see you, hear you. It's not too much to ask, he said, his voice quiet, but each word struck directly at my heart. I felt something inside me break. For the first time in a long time, I stopped holding my emotions back. Tears started streaming down my cheeks, and I quickly turned away, ashamed of my feelings. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make a scene," I mumbled, wiping my eyes. "Alice," he said, gently touching my shoulder, and I looked back at him. "You can be yourself. You don't have to be perfect all the time." His words caught me off guard. I stared at him, wondering how he could see the things I'd tried so hard to hide. We sat there for a few more minutes in silence. His presence was almost tangible, but never oppressive. It was one of those rare moments where silence didn't feel heavy. When I finally got up to leave, he stood with me. "Thank you for listening," I said. "Thank you for trusting me," he replied, and in his voice, I heard that same quiet confidence that always made me feel more at ease. On the way home, I kept replaying his words in my head. "You deserve to be appreciated." Those simple phrases echoed like a soft mantra, repeated without me even realizing it. When I returned, Michael was already asleep on the couch, an old movie playing on the TV. I covered him with a blanket and went to the bedroom, but sleep never came. I lay in the dark, listening to his steady breathing from the other room, and wondered how things had become so empty. I can't say for sure when it started. Everything seemed so innocent. Brief conversations near the house, advice about repairs, chance meetings in the park. But now I found myself looking for excuses to cross paths with Oliver. I'd find something that needed to be taken to a neighbor, recall some unnecessary items I could offer him. It was like a game I couldn't refuse, even knowing its rules were leading me to the edge of a cliff. One day, I noticed his car parked near the house, and it became a signal for me. I came up with an excuse, a small decoration for his living room that I had accidentally found in my closet. He opened the door, looking slightly surprised, but wearing that same gentle smile I had already begun to think of as my own. "Alice, saving me again?" "Just thought this might come in handy," I said, handing him the box. He took it, but didn't step aside right away. "Would you like to come in? Have something to drink?" I hesitated, but only for a second. Why not? Inside, his house was transforming. Textiles, paintings, new chairs, everything we'd talked about before. "It seems you actually took my advice," I said, smiling. "Well, it would have been foolish to ignore it," he replied, looking at me for a bit too long to call it an ordinary glance. We talked about renovations, neighbors, trivial matters, but the conversation kept circling back to us, to what we felt but didn't say out loud. "You know this is wrong," I said, more to myself than to him. "Sometimes what seems wrong is the only thing that's right," he answered. I couldn't find the words to argue. Back home, I tried once again to ground myself in reality. Michael was in his study, but when he heard my footsteps, he came out into the living room. "Alice, where have you been?" he asked, glancing at the clock. "Out for a walk. I needed some air," I replied, taking off my coat. He looked at me longer than usual, as if trying to read something between the lines. "Are you okay?" he finally asked. I hated lying. It burned me from the inside. But I hated pretending even more. "Of course," I said, avoiding his gaze. "Alice, you've been different lately. I can't explain it, but I feel it. You used to avoid me before, but now it's like something more." His words hurt me more than I expected. He was trying to break through the wall I had built myself, but I couldn't let him. "I'm just stressed, Michael. Everything's fine, really." "Are you sure?" He looked at me with doubt. I nodded and tried to smile. "Everything's fine." That night, I lay in bed staring into the darkness. Michael's breathing was even and calm, but I found myself thinking about the house across the street. I knew I had crossed a line, but inside, everything screamed that I couldn't stop. Those moments with Oliver weren't just a comfort anymore, they had become my oxygen. And I understood that the deeper I went into this, the fewer chances I had of ever coming back. The house was filled with a silence that strangely resonated with the chaos inside me. Michael had left on a business trip, leaving nothing but a note on the kitchen table. "I'll be back in a couple of days. Don't forget to relax." Those words felt like a mockery. He was telling me to relax, oblivious to how tightly wound I was inside. I decided to distract myself by cleaning. Michael's things, scattered around the house, seemed to scream of his presence even in his absence. I carefully folded his clothes, but my hands trembled involuntarily. Each movement reminded me of how far apart our lives had grown. I was heading upstairs with a laundry basket when I heard a quiet knock at the door. My heart suddenly quickened, and I set the basket down quickly. Opening the door, I found Oliver standing there with a small box in his hands, looking as though he was wrestling with hesitation. "Am I interrupting?" he asked softly. I shook my head. "Did something happen?" He smiled faintly. "I just wanted to say thank you for the advice about the house. I thought I'd stop by and give you something." He lifted the box, but I barely noticed it. My gaze focused on his eyes, which lingered on me a moment longer than they should have. "Do you want to come in?" I heard myself say before I had the chance to think. He hesitated briefly, but then nodded. We went upstairs, and I paused to set the laundry basket aside. Oliver stayed near the doorway of the bedroom, but I could feel his presence, subtle yet warm, his gaze anchoring me. I stood before the mirror, forgetting that I had left the door slightly ajar behind me. Unbuttoning my shirt, I slipped it off and began to fix my hair. In the reflection, I saw Oliver freeze at the sight of me. His eyes widened, and I felt a wave of heat rush through me. For a moment, our eyes met through the mirror. I didn't know what he was thinking, but his gaze held something indescribable. It was awe, admiration, and most of all, desire. I froze, unable to say or do anything. Time seemed to stand still. The only thing I managed was a slight nod in his direction. That was enough. He approached slowly, saying nothing. What followed happened without words. His hands, his gaze, his breath. It was a revelation. There was no roughness or urgency. It was slow, deliberate, as if we both knew this moment would change everything. I didn't think about what would come after. I didn't think about Michael, our life, or how wrong this was. In that moment, there was only us. Afterward, he lay beside me while I stared at the ceiling, trying to gather my thoughts. The silence that had once been oppressive now felt different. It was a silence of realization. "Alice, are you okay?" he asked finally, lifting his head slightly. I didn't know how to answer. Was I okay? Number, but at the same time, I felt a strange calm, as though I had finally found something I'd been missing for so long. "Yes," I replied, avoiding his gaze. But guilt was already beginning to creep in. It rose slowly, like the tide. I knew it would eventually overwhelm me. When he left, I returned to the bedroom. Michael's belongings were exactly where I had left them. I looked at his sweater lying on the bed and felt everything inside me crumble. I couldn't keep pretending anymore. Everything had changed. What had once been subtle hints and a dangerous game had crossed a line, leaving no way back. Oliver had become more than just a neighbor to me, but I couldn't stop thinking about the price I would pay for it. Relationships with Michael had become unbearably tense over the past few weeks. His usual aloofness had morphed into an intense scrutiny. I could feel his eyes on me, noticing every detail. My late returns home, my distracted answers, my unusually long walks. Things he used to overlook were now the focus of his attention. I tried to appear calm. I invented explanations, excuses, but I knew it was temporary. Sooner or later, he would piece it all together. One day, as I was walking back from Oliver's, I felt someone watching me. His house was just a few meters away from ours, and I thought I could slip by unnoticed. but as I approached our door, I saw Michael in the window. He stood there motionless, his face void of expression, yet his eyes betrayed something unsettling, a mix of suspicion and disappointment. "Were you at the neighbor's?" he asked the moment I walked in. I froze. "Yes," I replied, trying to sound casual. "He asked for help choosing decor." Michael said nothing, but his gaze told me he didn't believe me. In the days that followed, he became even more withdrawn, though his questions grew more frequent. "You've been spending a lot of time away from home," he remarked one evening at dinner, setting his fork down sharply. I looked up, trying to gauge where this was leading. "I just need some time to myself, Michael. It's not about you." He squinted, his stare becoming heavier. "Are you sure?" "Of course," I replied quickly, avoiding his eyes. But his silence hung in the air like an invisible noose, tightening with each passing day. Michael didn't stay silent for long. One evening, when I returned later than usual, he was waiting for me in the living room. His face no longer bore its customary indifference. "Tell me what's going on," he demanded. I tried to turn away, but he stood up, blocking my path. "Alice, I'm not a fool. Do you think I don't notice? You come home looking like someone trying to cover their tracks." I sighed, panic welling up inside me. "Michael, you're imagining things. I'm just trying to figure myself out." "Figure yourself out?" His voice turned sharp. "Or figure out your meetings with the neighbor." The words hit like a slap. I realized he knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to piece it together. "I don't know what you're talking about," I tried to deflect. "Enough, Alice," he cut me off. "Do you think I didn't see you leaving his house? Do you think I haven't noticed how you avoid me like I'm a stranger?" I felt tears welling up, not because of his accusations, but because I no longer had the strength to lie. "You want to know?" I shouted, meeting his gaze. "Fine. Yes, I was at his house. And yes, there's something between us." His face contorted with pain. That was the worst part. His eyes held no anger, only despair. "Why?" he asked quietly. "What did I do wrong?" I closed my eyes, searching for the right words, but there were none. Anything I could say felt hollow, meaningless. "It's not you, Michael. It's me. I felt invisible, forgotten." He fell silent, as if weighing my words, then sighed and looked at me with cold resolve. "I only want to know one thing. Do you love him?" That question tore me apart inside. I didn't know how to answer. Did I love Oliver? Or was I simply seeking in him what I had lost in Michael? I turned away, unable to meet his eyes. "I don't know," I finally said. His silence was louder than any scream. He turned and walked into the bedroom, leaving me standing alone in the living room, surrounded by the crushing weight of emptiness. The night, like a black blanket, had descended over the city. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching my head in my hands. Michael had left the house hours ago, tossing only a curt "I need to think" over his shoulder. Since then, the only sound I'd heard was the ticking of the clock in the living room. In the silence, all my emotions, anger, guilt, confusion, crashed over me in waves, leaving emptiness in their wake. At some point, I realized I couldn't just sit there anymore. I got up, walked to the desk, and grabbed a sheet of paper. Almost involuntarily, I began to write. The words poured out of me as though a dam had burst. "Michael, I don't know if you'll read this, but I'll try to explain anyway. Not to justify myself, that would be pointless, but to explain how I ended up here, where we both are. At first, it seemed like nothing. You started staying late at work, and our conversations became routine exchanges. How was your day? What's for dinner? I knew you loved me, but I stopped feeling it. We started living alongside each other, but not together. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was normal. But eventually, I noticed my feelings for everything around me dulling. You probably think this all began with Oliver, but it didn't. It started long before him. He was just the one who made me feel what I'd been missing. That doesn't excuse what I did. I know I betrayed you. But Michael, I betrayed myself too. I became a woman I never wanted to see in the mirror. Forgive me, if you can. And know that it's not your fault I lost myself. Alice. I reread the letter, folded it, and placed it on the desk. There was no point in leaving it somewhere conspicuous. I knew he'd find it eventually. A strange sense of calm settled over me. I didn't expect forgiveness, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had done something honest. The next morning, I found myself in the car. I didn't know why I'd gotten behind the wheel. I just wanted to drive, anywhere. Turning off the street, I soon reached an intersection and came to a stop. Two roads stretched out before me. One led back home. A home that had become too familiar, too predictable. A place where my old life lived. The life where I had always known who I was, yet no longer felt like myself. The other road led away. It was full of uncertainty, but also freedom and the promise of something new. I didn't know what lay ahead if I chose it, but that was both terrifying and enticing. I stared at the traffic light, indifferent to when it would turn green. My hands gripped the wheel, its coolness grounding me, and I closed my eyes. Inside, emotions raged, like two forces pulling me in opposite directions. My thoughts drifted back to Michael, to our home, to Oliver, to what I had broken and what I had tried to build. But most of all, they circled back to myself, to the woman who had wanted to be heard, to be seen, yet had lost her way. The cars behind me honked their horns. I opened my eyes. The camera pans out slowly, leaving me at the crossroads where each path promises something different. The decision wasn't spoken aloud. It stayed within me, a secret known only to myself.